From visionary design to visionary construction. And it's an honor for me to introduce Nitesh Magdani, Director of Sustainability within Royal BAMB Group. And he's an experienced sustainable design architect with a passion for efficiency, embedding sustainable design within building information modeling. Mr. Magdani leads the BAMB work within the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, currently developing the valuable proposition for circularity within the built environment. So please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks for inviting me. And as you can see, we share the same project name, BAMB, as our company name, so that's quite handy. So I just want to talk about, I think through the presentation, in no particular order, we'll talk about the value proposition. And, you know, for us, as we've been experiencing the initial phases of the circular economy within BAMB, we've realized that the value proposition is really important, and it's something that we're trying to get our heads around as we're doing new and more and more projects. So I think that's really important, and we'll share our experience with you to date, and the work that we're doing with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and some of you within the room, the BRE, IBM, EPIA as well, in trying to define what circularity in the built environment means. So I'll share that with you, and the main message here is that we like to collaborate, and then that's the only way that we're going to actually get to our end goal, which is to achieve a circular environment. So a diagram that we put together probably a couple of years ago, actually, internally within BAMB, and it helped us to explain the interrelationship between sustainability, FM, how we manage our buildings, and BIM, so building information modeling or management. And actually, this, for me, describes our approach to the circular economy as well, because as we're speaking to our clients, we realize that what they're after is a building that we can assure them is going to perform as intended, whether that's through energy purposes or maintenance. This actually helps us to describe how we link sustainability to the operational phase of the building, which is primarily the most important. It's not as important that we reduce our emissions during the construction cycle of the building, or we reduce the waste during the construction life cycle of the building, but actually that we can think of the whole building in operation as a whole and how we can reduce that impact on the environment. Circular contracts have been in place for years, so this is not something new. It's just that we're choosing to badge it as circular economy at the moment. So as an example, we've been involved as a company both designing, constructing and operating or managing and financing buildings, infrastructure projects, etc. So as an example, we built a large section of the A12 motorway in the Netherlands, 30 kilometers, and we have in our agreement the incentive to manage that for 22 and a half years. So the key message there is that we had to employ the partners, the supply chain, the value chain to achieve that. So in essence, that's an incentivized contract that made sure that BAM were making it fit for purpose, i.e. to keep those materials at their useful content for as long as possible. So our first circular building, and it does have inverted commas around it. I actually normally refer to it as semicircular. And as Katya would say, it's designed with linear products, but within a circular framework. So, this was our first learning journey, and I think we sort of achieved, a great deal through this experience. It's the Bremen Town Hall in the Netherlands. And if I take you through the brief, essentially the client started a competition, which we sort of bid for with our sub-consultants, the architects, Turn 2 and Thomas Rau Architects. And actually the competition brief was to outline a building that will extend the occupation for the municipality at Bremen for a further 20 years, after which time they didn't know whether they would exist as a municipality, as a single entity, or combined with other regions, etc. But they'd outgrown that space. So it was really up to us as the designer, as the contractor, to actually propose something that was fit for purpose. So the response really was that we took not just the capital cost, but we included the maintenance, the durability, the life cycle. So it was really the whole building performance that we tendered for. And actually, through doing that, we assured the client that actually you have a fixed building outlay. You know, if you think of not just the capital, but the maintenance, the durability, and the life cycle, we can assure you of the performance of that building to a better extent than you would otherwise. So it's that guarantee, and it's really by working with our supply chain that we're able to do that. So yes, we took essentially a linear design, and we made it circular. You know, we actually made sure that we put in place contracts that incentivized the supply chain to give us, or to give the client, the performance that they wanted. So as you can see, we've renovated, we used the existing building, we've also extended the building. There were certain innovations within that sort of enabled us to think about how to design for circularity, but also, as it says, to consider the building as a materials depot for that 20-year period. So two examples. Okay, so the timber structure, the engineers designed, as you would normally, you'd have beams of a certain depth in between columns. And in discussion with the supply chain, with the supplier of the glulam beams, it was decided that actually if we make the beams, say, 2 inches deeper than they needed to be, then in 20 years' time, if it comes round to actually dismantling the building, that those components would be worth more, and they can effectively be put back on the shelf to be resold again later. So this is all about retaining value, retaining asset value. Okay, and another example we'll come to later. But essentially, what we're looking at is, yes, incentivizing the supply chain to give you a building that's made of components, materials, systems that retain its asset value at its highest level for longer. So that's the ultimate goal. But instead of just designing for deconstruction, what we're starting to do is start to gear up the supply chain to think about reuse, think about reassembly, as Katja was saying earlier. And that becomes the prime importance to us, is how do we facilitate both the designer to design something that's sustainable, can be reused again, work with the supply chain to actually get them to re-engineer those design processes so that they can take back their components, their materials. But also, how can we retain that asset value? And it's by doing all of those things. So some of the agreements that we had in place were for the installations. You can see there, that's the interior atrium of the building. There's the walls, the lighting, tiles, furniture. So we sort of took a cross-section of some of the key components of the building and made circular contracts, so actually giving performance contracts. So the other example is lighting. So in talking to Philips Lighting, we had a long negotiation period with them, but again, the incentivization for them was to give us the product that would deliver the lighting levels, so the lighting as a service, rather than actually giving the client the lighting installation, because actually that's no use to them whatsoever. What they're wanting is the light levels, so the 300 lux that they asked us to deliver on their either floor or work surface, and for the period of 15 to 20 years. And actually that's much more valuable to them, but it encouraged Philips to talk to the architect, to Thomas Rau, and to the cladding consultants to ensure that there was enough natural light getting through the windows in the first place to extend the efficiency of that lighting. So those negotiations and actually getting those discussions up front was key to actually solving the design dilemmas that we had. So if we look at the linear model, what normally happens on a construction project, you can see at the bottom, you start with your raw materials, you produce something, it gets used and then eventually disposed of. And at various points in the manufacture, the composition, the installation, the use, repair cycles, the maintenance cycles, you generate waste. And what we're trying to do is design out that waste in the first place by being proactive. So what we're trying to do is, go through that cycle and actually return those materials into, raw materials so that can be done again. But actually, ideally what we want to do is to extend the product's life rather than it going back into raw materials and being recycled as is currently done. We're trying to extend that by producing a service contract, so performance models, so that in use we can maintain that product for as long as possible. And you've all seen the butterfly diagram from cradle to cradle. Essentially what we want to do is sort of maintain those inner loops so that we're reusing rather than recycling, repurposing, etc. And then eventually those products will be disassembled at some point. They'll hopefully go back to manufacturers, and essentially be used for other purposes. Now, we want to upcycle as much as possible rather than downcycle, and there are ways that we can start designing around that future use, that future life. But also, essentially, what we're trying to do in discussions with our suppliers at the moment is think about how do we maintain the performance levels within our buildings, the infrastructure, because we know that technology will advance over the next 5 years or 10 years. Legislation will also increase to make our buildings more efficient. So can we build in, and we're trying to talk to our manufacturers and suppliers to say, actually, we want to build in a clause within your contract that says, after 8 to 10 years, we know that the lighting levels in your building will deteriorate. It's a fact, it will do. But actually, is there a way that we can say, we want you, as the lighting supplier or manufacturer, to think about how you can upgrade that lighting after 8 to 10 years so that the client gets the best quality product. And what it does is that level of thinking starts to encourage the lighting supplier and manufacturer that they need to think about not just the product at day one, at point of sale, but they need to think about the future upgrades that they need to allow for that, and therefore building in that capacity. And again, as Katya said, the cost should come down over time. So essentially, you're getting a more efficient product over time, and it won't be obsolete. So just a quick, overview of how we're using BIM within our sort of, capturing of data. So we're trying to think about building information modeling in the sense that actually we should be capturing the life cycle data from our buildings, and that should be linked to, the maintenance, the durability, the life cycle, so that ultimately you're developing that material passport. And I think this starts to embody a lot of the principles that we're trying to get through the BAMB project as well, in that, we want to actually develop a template so that actually there are resources available to everyone, which are open source for everyone to use. And ultimately, our buildings will talk to each other. They'll understand what we need, what meeting rooms are available at any given time. They'll calculate the occupancy available. And essentially that information management that we're building into our buildings will help us to operate those buildings more efficiently over time. So a couple of quick examples of other projects we've been involved in. In the Netherlands, we have a lot of experience, partly because, 2 years ago now, I think Amsterdam said that they wanted to be the first circular economy hotspot in the world. And as a result, a lot of publicly procured projects are coming out which are starting to dictate that they want a circular outcome. So one of the sort of fit-out projects that we bid for very interesting because they're thinking about a building that's fit for purpose for the first 6 years as a fit out, but then after that 6-year period, those materials and components can be reused again. So actually, instead of just building it or designing it as modular that can be customized and thinking about retention value after that 6 years, we went one step further, and that was to think about actually getting a second user for that product. And for me, that's very important because you can design something for circularity, you can design something to be deconstructed, but it doesn't mean it's going to be. So by securing that second lease of life, you're actually designing for the second life as well as the first. Another example is the project that we're working on at the moment for ABN AMRO. And again, this was something that we've been heavily involved with. The client is interested in developing circular outcomes. And through this process, when we got involved, the architects were already in place. And actually what we're doing is we're turning a standard design into a circular product. So when we started looking at the drawings, our team found that the building wasn't designed for circularity, it wasn't designed for deconstruction. And as we're working with the architects and the engineers, we're advising them on how best to design for circularity, and actually getting the manufacturers and supply chain involved as well, as early as possible. And it's that engagement that we're able to get the best value. So when we look back at the Bremen Town Hall, we can see that after 20 years we had about 20% retention value of those materials and components after 20 years. And with the pavilion in Amsterdam, we're achieving values in excess of 50% after 20 years. So there's a huge change in how we are approaching those contracts with our supply chain to get the best out of those products, the specification, the design, and essentially the deals that we're doing with our supply chain to get the most for our clients. And I just wanted to share some inspiration that I sort of found from other colleagues in the Netherlands, where they've been talking to a sculptor, for example, who does sort of 5D printing. Now, the sculptor uses sand for his 3D printing objects. So essentially that's the composition. And after the first use of this product, it can actually be broken down back into sand and then remade again. So again, we're starting to think of how buildings can be reused through 3D printing potentially. And in collaboration with the architects, there's a prototype bench here. It was actually designed as a building, but I think the city of Amsterdam wanted to use it for their nightlife, so they painted it some sort of luminescent colour. And essentially this is potentially going to be rolled out at the Expo in Amsterdam next year. Another example that I came across, a lot of us here, I can see most people have kids here, of that age, whereby as our kids are growing, I thought this was a great idea because it just shows how we can utilize the products that we buy for our children as they're growing up. So, this tricycle or a quad bike could end up being, evolved over time so that, you don't end up storing lots of different bicycles over time, but actually you're making things work for you and adaptable and flexible as your children grow, as your needs change. So the work we're doing with the CE100, with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we're sort of leading on the business models group. And essentially what we're trying to get across in the work that we're doing is that actually we need to incentivize the value chain as they're working on our building. And for circular economy to work, all of the value chain need to be incentivized. It's not just a win-win for the end user, but actually we need to incentivize the lighting suppliers, the manufacturers of steel, concrete, timber, etc., that actually this will be better for them in the long run. They'll be able to retain their products, will be able to retain asset value at its highest level for longer. But also, acknowledging that the operational phase of the building is by far the most important, because it's there for longest. And then, as we talked about earlier, we need to retain that value by, those inner loops of reuse, reusability, repurposing, etc., for as long as possible. And then, we need to think about how we reuse and repurpose those materials, components, products in other industries potentially, or whether we can actually take those buildings or materials, kit of parts, and actually use them elsewhere. So again, it's not just thinking about the first use, it's thinking about their subsequent uses as well. And that's really how we can retain that value. So some of the enablers that we found within our working group, the key things are, looking at design, how we can design for deconstruction or design for circularity, to enable that future flexibility, how we can design with information, with the right information at hand, so that we can look at the life cycle data, look at the ownership, how can we retain ownership, who's responsible to maintain the products, and what information do we need after the initial use to enable that to be reused again, and at what value. And for us, the collaboration is key as well. It's actually making sure that every member of the supply chain is incentivized, and that we do think of innovation. We do think, of actually trying to re-engineer products so that design becomes an inherent part of the process, not just for the architects and designers, but for the manufacturers and suppliers as well. And some of the outputs, obviously operation being one of the main things, but thinking about the building as a kit of parts, thinking about the asset value, how we can retain that at its highest level for longer. And what we haven't touched on is waste. Now, waste is an output of the building, which obviously over time we produce a lot of waste, and what we want to do is through recapturing that information, through reusing those components, we want to minimize waste. But it doesn't, when I talk to clients, it's not the first thing that I would say. It's certainly a byproduct, but actually the incentive for me to talk to a client is that we're helping them to ensure that that building will perform at its highest level for longer, not that it's going to reduce waste, because actually clients generally are not that concerned with waste. So lastly, last slide, we're involved in a lot of steering groups, obviously leading the work with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and also the Green Construction Board with some others here. We're actually, knowing that our suppliers and manufacturers are not really thinking long term, we're starting a series of workshops to try and encourage them to understand the benefits, the opportunities of thinking of long term, how they can actually remanufacture their products to design for longer. And obviously, along with the BAMB project, there's various other projects that we're involved in, both in the Netherlands, but also in the UK, where we're starting to think of circular solutions that we need to roll out and pilot projects. So really, the last thing from me is that we love collaborating with other industries, we love collaborating with other disciplines, members of the value chain. So if there's any projects that you feel you want to collaborate with us on, we'd be happy to do that. Thank you.